Oh, good. All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining the fastest path to equity, how California apartment owners can leverage ADUs for substantial value growth. My name is Clay Llewellyn. I am the COO of Income Property Specialists, one of the principal owners of the firm. We specialize in third-party fee management and been managing apartments in the Bay Area for over 40 years now. I'd like to introduce the founder and president of our firm, Robert Solwasser.
Thanks, Clay. Oh, hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Robert Salzer. I helped start Income Property Specialists over 40 years ago. I'm the part that's over 40 years old in Clay's presentation. And as Clay said, we're a third-party fee-based management company. We're based in Cupertino, California, right in the heart of Silicon Valley. And we specialize in the management of multifamily or apartment buildings, mid-size and larger, throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. In a first of our planned quarterly webinars, we're going to dive into the topic of ADUs today, or additional dwelling units. And this will be for apartment owners in the San Francisco Bay Area. We'll talk about and discuss what ADUs are and why IPS certainly recommends apartment owners seriously consider adding ADUs to their apartment buildings. I'm joined and thrilled to have joining the seminar Mark Hogan, who's a principal architect of the architectural firm OpenScope based in San Francisco. Mark and his team have been designing and helping apartment owners add ADUs to their apartment buildings for a number of years. Mark and his team have been doing this in San Francisco even before the state of California initiated the start of allowing ADUs back in January of 2020. Mark, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Robert.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark. I'll have you lead the discussion today, and I'll pop in from time to time, probably with a couple of questions for you.
Sure, sounds great.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, as Robert said, I'm principal at OpenScope Studio. We started thinking about ADUs back when we wrote the ADU handbook for the San Francisco Planning Department in 2014, and that was kind of the genesis of the idea of the multifamily ADU in California. Previously, multifamily ADUs were not really a thing. ADUs were typically backyard cottages. They were legalized in some jurisdictions, but not everywhere. They were common in places like Santa Cruz and Berkeley, but you didn't really see them much in most of the Bay Area. As Robert mentioned, in 2020, building on some success with single-family ADUs, the state legalized a similar type of ADU that had been legalized 5 years earlier in San Francisco. And this is a multifamily ADU, which is really like a density bonus that lets you add more units to an apartment building or an apartment property. And so there's a lot of ways to do that. There's ADUs, maybe like you traditionally think of, that is a prefab building or a site-built building that's just behind another building, and it's like a cottage or a tiny house kind of thing. The ADUs you usually see in apartment buildings, though, are often converted space, like unused storage or parking garage, where maybe you've got extra surface parking, you don't need all the covered parking. And so the state law lets you do all these things. The state law lets you build some detached units. It lets you convert space. There's limits on each, and those have been changing over time. And so the most recent version lets you build up to 8 detached units, assuming you've already got 8 units on the property. So up to 8, you can match the count of the existing units. And those would be built on like extra parking, undeveloped land, maybe an old tennis court. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, that's why there's a real, and the title of this topic, the fastest path to equity. Mark, you've mentioned that as long as your property has more than 8 units, you can add 8 units to the property. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that means that an owner of an 8-plex here in California, and especially here in the San Francisco area where you and I are based, that means you can turn your 8-plex into a 16-unit building, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, the second part of it is the conversion units. So you could theoretically add more than 8 units to the property. You could, if you had some tuck under parking, you could add a couple units there. If you had an 8-plex, you could add up to 2 conversion units because you can add 25% of your existing unit count. So you could theoretically add 2 units into the main building, and then you could also add detached units. This would all be governed by the building code and the fire code and the other rules that are in the ADU law, but they're much more relaxed than what would typically be in zoning.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. And down at the bottom of that list on the screen, you see zoning changes. And I think the benefit of doing ADUs is that they provide a way out of having to comply with the zoning that the city has put on the site. So you can remove parking if you're adding ADUs. You don't have to provide parking for the new units. You can ignore the lot coverage. You for the most part, you don't have to follow the city setbacks. You're only following the ADU setbacks, which are much smaller. So there's a lot of leeway here, and it's supposed to be a ministerial permit, meaning they can't have hearings. They can't make you get a variance to do anything that's allowed under state law. And so it's a much easier. You've probably heard the horror stories, or maybe you've tried to permit a new house or an addition, and you went through the ringer for 2 years with the planning department, and the ADU law cuts through a lot of that and lets you do this in a much more straightforward way.
And Mark, if I understood you correctly, there's no posting or communication going out to the neighbors surrounding area that this is what you're going to do, unlike some other planning projects, correct?
Right. There are jurisdictions though where you may have to notify the tenants in the building, which is probably a good idea anyway. So in general though, you don't have to do neighborhood notification for ADU projects, with maybe a few very minor exceptions, but the general rule is that no, there's not any notification. And so it's more like a building permit process, than a traditional planning entitlement process.
Great.
Which is why a lot of investors, who even maybe we've seen multifamily investors that have never bought existing buildings before, all of a sudden getting very interested in this, knowing that they can build units and sort of do an end run around the normal planning process. And so, the increase in value is really, that you're often able to add the additional units for below the cost of buying units on the market, or below the cost of what those units will be worth, based on the rental value when you're done.
We'll get into more detail on that and the equity, the valuation of it, Mark, and along with some of the offsets, the expenses, initially and ongoing as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, and the thing that makes it ADU ready is that you really need to look at the existing building and the layout of the site and have room to do the ADUs in a way that kind of makes sense construction wise. We do a lot of feasibility for studies for people to look at these items here to figure out if the ADUs are actually going to fit in the building and sort of make sense from a construction standpoint. I will say that if you just have space to add one unit in a 80 unit compound, it might not make sense to build it because you're going to have a lot of overhead to add 1 unit. However, if you add 6 units or 10 units, the cost per door can really go down substantially. And so, figuring out an efficient way to do this is often figuring out how to make it a bit of a bigger project so that you get the economy of scale of doing multiple units. The one piece here that I would warn is the utility capacity is a big one, and that's one you definitely have to study. And there is some if you ever dealt with PG&E, I think you probably know what I'm getting at. There is definitely some unpredictability even during construction on things that they might require. So that's definitely one of the items that has to be looked at pretty carefully on existing buildings.
Well, yeah, PG&E is number one on the list of who the pleasure will have of dealing with, right? Behind them is also going to be the water company and also the fire department. They can insert their requirements as well.
Yeah, so these are complicated projects. These are not like design build projects with a contractor. It's more like getting a building permit for a new multifamily building. It's not really like a single family type project. And so here's a case study, put together that I think is what you were talking about with the equity add based on the valuation of the units. I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit, Robert.
Yeah. When Clay and I, when others on my team go to look at a property that a client of ours will go take a look at a property, one of the very first things we look at, because we're just kind of wired that way as well, and with the knowledge we've got in working with you, Mark, over the last couple of years, it's just, is there capability, can we add ADUs? And immediately we're looking at that. Because, and the number is going to vary, but it's going to be somewhere for us in the Bay Area, probably around $200,000 a unit to complete. Don't quote me, that's not an upper limit. That's just what we're finding. And it's in that range probably of 200 to 250,000 per unit. Well, all of us in the industry know that you're going to be selling apartment buildings for far above that. You're probably looking at 350, 400, close to $500,000 depending on location. So the projects, the client profile is how long are you into the property for? And if you're selling the property, do you have an opportunity to sell the potential of ADUs as well? I'm kind of surprised that being in the industry, that there are a number of owners and also brokers that aren't familiar with ADUs or the process or the potential involved with it. And IPS is an asset management firm. That's kind of our job. That's what we do with clients, is bring that forward. So the first thing we look at, can we do it, right? The scope of it, how many units can we add? What type of units, right? If we do tuck under parking, inherently there's going to be a design constraint that, as good as Mark is as an architect, you're going to have a couple of dark corners in that tuck under parking, right? And you go forward and you want to pick out some higher end finishes, because what you're really left with after the construction is pretty much a Class A unit. It's brand new, and you don't have any functional obsolescence that you might have in units that were built in the 60s, 70s. Most of the apartment inventory in the Bay Area, except, the older cities, San Francisco, Oakland, can go back to the, 1900s. But that's the potential and where you see the gain in that. And not only the gain, but you're also adding more income to the property, right? If you're building studios out of tuck under parking, you're going to be looking north of $1,000, $2,000, depending upon the size of the unit, obviously the geographic location, obviously the amenities of the building, but you will gain income, okay? And when you add income, most of it's going to flow to the bottom line. It's going to affect your net operating income, your NOI, which is how most value properties should be valued. And that's where the gain, as well as you've got just in the cash flow. And just in project duration too, I have to urge everyone to talk to a lawyer. And I urge you to talk to a lawyer that's got not only experience in this type of field, in land use planning and in design construction, but you really need someone involved with rent control, because the other impact is, we've been told by our attorneys that the units we build are going to be off rent control, and they're going to be off rent control for a 15-year period, both any local rent control restrictions as well as the state. Which means in those rent control jurisdictions where you're not allowed RUBS or ratio utility billing, in other words, passing through the utilities of the building, you are now allowed to do that on your ADUs. And you've got that for 15 years. And what you also have, you have a brand new unit that probably is not going to need a whole lot of maintenance over time, right? Because it's a brand new unit. So there's all these multiplier effects of income and the opportunity, the potential. That's the real impact on an equity valuation of these ADU projects.
Yeah, and on the project duration here, I would say it would be longer than this in the Bay Area, just to set a realistic expectation. It's not going to be 10 months in the Bay Area, but it's also not going to be like building a new construction apartment building. And that's going to depend a lot on which city you're in, how big of a project it is, who the contractor is, et cetera. But those are all kind of things that you can start figuring out at the beginning of the project to sort of have a realistic expectation of when you're going to see that completed.
Yeah, anybody getting involved with ADUs, just expect you're going to have change orders.
Yeah, and I would say that it's something where you're going to be able, like a lot of these older buildings have deferred maintenance. We all know, the materials from the 70s don't always hold up the best. And doing the ADU project is often a chance where the owner can wrap some other needed work into the construction project and maybe get that package into a construction loan, like where you could do a lot of times the ADU basically can become a sort of low budget seismic upgrade. The seismic upgrade can just be integrated into the design of the ADU. It doesn't have to be a standalone project then. It's also an opportunity to get a lot of like old plumbing replaced, as you're doing the plumbing work for the new units. It can be a chance to upgrade the whole property by incorporating some of the common area work into the ADU project budget.
And that's a great point, Mark, when you mentioned seismic, because San Francisco's gone through it, Oakland's gone through it, the third largest city in the Bay Area, San Jose, they were going to have a seismic retrofit program among their multifamily. They set it back a year, so now it will start April 1st of 2026. No guarantees, but there's the potential that if you do have tuck under parking, which tuck under parking buildings are pretty much almost, probably a 90% probability, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, that they're going to be affected by requiring a seismic retrofit. Because the tuck under parking, the building can not only go up and down and shake a little bit, it can sway back and forth, and that's when the second floor falls into the garage, right? But if you do put a couple of ADUs in that tuck under parking, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but you've got new walls, you've got new structure holding that up, and there is the possibility that by adding an ADU, not only do you get the benefits of that, but you also deal with your seismic retrofit issue.
Yeah, and the ADU project often triggers required seismic work, even just to put the units in. So then you can take care of the whole soft story, pretty economically by putting in plywood shear walls instead of moment frames or something that you might be doing otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And just the seismic work can be, depending on the size of the building, it could be an $80,000, $100,000, $200,000 project all on its own with no real benefit to your income versus doing the ADU project.
Right. Thanks, Mark.
Great. So let's go to the next one. Just a high level overview of, feasibility review to even see if the project makes sense, which we talked about before, kind of like, is this site suitable for adding units? Are there any things that are going to make it impossible, or any big problems we can see with the project down the line? What's the unit count? How much square footage is it going to be? Design and planning of the project. So that's where the architect comes in, the other consultants, structural engineer, mechanical engineer, et cetera, all come in and do their work. Permitting, usually handled by the design team who is familiar with the drawings. We'll go through the permitting process with the city. If you look online, you'll see that it's supposed to be a 60-day approval. It is never really a 60-day approval because there's always back and forth over, items that need to be addressed, things the city's asking for, clarification. So maybe give it 4 months for permitting. And then you're in construction. And a lot of times people probably use the permitting time to bid out the work. Sometimes people have a contractor lined up all the way back in the design phase, but construction is, probably a year-long process. It can vary. It could be as short as 4 or 5 months for a smaller project. Could be 16 months if you're doing a really big project. And getting that to completion, and then leasing support where you're going to be marketing, because you're going to have a bunch of new units all coming onto the market at once. Probably getting them photographed, getting the landscaping upgraded, thinking about those common area improvements, to really make those new units shine. And that, that's where Robert's team can really, really help you with that piece of it.
Mark, let me go through a couple of these 5 sections here. On the feasibility review, typically I'll have a phone call. You'll come out, we'll walk the property, and I'll challenge you to add the number of units. You'll go, that's nice, Robert, that's not going to work. Or Robert, what about this? So some of the things, Mark, your experience with this, because you go back to doing this before 2020, before the law happened throughout California. But when you walk on a property, obviously tuck under parking, because parking's not a consideration. You don't need a 1.2 parking spaces for each unit that you add
Right.
or whatever the parking restriction is, right? So
Right.
parking's kind of off. It's nice if you've got it, but if you don't, it's not required. So when I walk on site, the first thing when I see tuck under parking is I think automatically ADUs, okay?
Mhm.
You've mentioned you walk on site and you see a tennis court and you automatically look ADU, right? What other things can be brought forward looking at a property that says we've got the potential for an ADU here?
I mean, I think that those are the big ones, honestly. I think people need to be realistic too, that like you are going to, if you want to do a larger ADU project, you're probably going to lose some parking, and you need to kind of figure out what you're comfortable with. It's, a lot of times people will come to us and be like, oh, we have like one laundry room in this complex and we want to add an ADU. And it's like, it's really not worth it at that point. If you've got a 150 square foot room in a 200 unit apartment complex, it's really not worth the trouble to just add that one unit. But if you can say, hey, like we're parked at 2.5 to 1 and we know we can get by with less parking, why don't we look at building 2 and convert all of that to units? That really starts to make sense. So I think the feasibility phase, it's helpful if the owner kind of comes into it understanding what kind of trade-offs they're willing to make, to move forward with the project. And thinking about the tennis court, thinking about the parking ratio, those are the kind of things you need to be thinking about. And you're right, those are kind of the big opportunities. There are sites that have like excess, just completely undeveloped land, not super common though in the core Bay Area. You're not going to find that in the middle of San Jose. But there are sites we've been to where like the jurisdiction had a really, really high parking ratio in 1980, and they've actually backed off it since. And the owner will say, well, yeah, we've got, 10 people that have, stored cars they haven't driven in 5 years over in the parking lot there. And we've got half the parking lot being used as storage by the maintenance guys. And like, we don't actually need all this parking anymore. That's actually fairly common.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The other thing that we see typically and look for ADUs are there are properties that do have separate garage buildings. We're working on one now with Open Scope. I call it a gift from the gods that they're just a series of garages that we're converting to ADUs, and it just works. It's a great project to do. We also take a look at if there are freestanding leasing offices that you may not need, or make it smaller or something, rec rooms, things like that. Again, it's a call on the philosophy and just the management style of the ownership. Surface parking, as you mentioned, and we've gone as far as to look at swimming pools in complexes to go, the pool's not only expense and a liability, nobody's really using the pool, right? Let's take a look at what it would take if we can do that. And some projects are going to be more involved, but that's the kind of things that we look at. The other thing that we come up with all the time is the carports. And even if they're not tuck under parking, if it's just a flat metal garage or even a built-up wood shingles garage, you can build ADUs above a carport.
Yeah, and that is something we, on a case-by-case basis, we need to review with jurisdictions, but that is something we're doing in some cities right now. So, and another interesting idea that is part of that feasibility phase, you mentioned the swimming pool. We had a project where we added 42 units, and part of making that feasible was removing the swimming pool, which was literally never used, removing the swimming pool and extending the surface parking lot into where the pool had been. So we were able to replace a lot of the parking spaces that we removed for the ADUs in a different location on the site to sort of keep the parking ratio where they wanted it.
That's why we want to bring Mark on site. Moving on the prior slide, design and planning. We had mentioned that utilities can be a bit of a surprise. They can delay it. They can have their own requirements, bringing transformers in on larger projects and so on. Remember that if you do that, and if you are involved with trenching, now your construction project has now turned into, now you're putting in new concrete or asphalt. Now you're doing hardscaping, right? And some of the projects, because of where you're putting the ADUs, now you're removing hardscape or asphalt, and you're putting in landscaping, try to blend it in with the building as well. Construction, just a couple of things to remember. The fire department can throw issues at you, but Mark, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but these ADUs are typically exempt from all the rules and regulations and requirements of new construction.
No.
Usually.
Let's
Okay,
let's back that up. That's not true. Yeah, you do have to
Okay.
follow the current building code, and there's really no way out of
Okay.
it. The thing you do get leeway on though is sprinkler coverage. So the state law says if the existing building is not sprinklered, the ADUs don't have to be sprinklered. And so generally speaking, on like a carport if you're converting tuck under parking, the building's from 1955, nothing in it is sprinklered. You can add those units and not worry about upgrading the building. There will be some like fire alarm upgrades and some other things that might get triggered, but you shouldn't have to add sprinkler coverage. Sometimes if you're doing, there's complicated projects where there might be other triggers for sprinkler coverage, but sort of the sort of base standard project that's following the what we sort of described under the state law, like that should not require adding sprinklers. And the sprinklers are a very high cost in the construction, because it's often pulling in another water meter.
Right.
It's a lot. It's more than just the sprinklers.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Your common questions. How long does it usually take?
I would say it's more like 2 years probably, but like it depends on the project. If you're just putting in 2 units and they're detached, it's probably a much shorter timeline. If you're doing like a big, you're doing a dozen tuck under parking units, that's just a much bigger construction project. And it also is going to take the city more time to review it. And so it really comes down to the scale of the project and how complicated it is and what city you're in.
Okay. The second question, how is it financed? We can get into that a little bit later in today's webinar because we've got a separate slide for that. And you're unsure about zoning. Obviously, that's when you hire the outside experts. You want to know what you've got before you start with any of this. A huge caveat to the people listening in on the webinar and starting to consider ADUs. You've got to talk to your lender before starting this process, okay? We've got properties that have got Fannie Mae financing, government financing. And I involved with this and made a phone call to the lender's representative, Fannie Mae Loan. On the other end of the phone, the representative said, Robert, I'm so glad you reached out to us first. You're only going to be limited to this many ADUs, not what you think you're entitled to under the ADU law. And that's because if you add too many units on your Fannie Mae loan, you're going to trigger an IRS audit. You're going to trigger an IRS issue, and the investors are going to be faced with a taxable event. And that means everybody's lawyering up, and now you're involved in litigation and you haven't, you can't do it. So you really need to talk to the lender so there's no surprises with them. Insurance companies will play a factor. During construction, you want to make sure the site's insured for this. And at the end, yes, you need to let the insurance company know that you've added 1, 2, 3, 5, 32 units to the building. And yes, they will adjust their premium for that. I've never seen a case where insurance is a large detriment to building an ADU and taking all the cash flow away from the project. So just something that you need to be aware of. Mark, a couple of other questions. If I've got permitted units in an apartment building, can I legalize them and call them ADUs?
Yeah, I mean, legalization is tricky. We actually don't typically take on those projects unless there's some sort of other units being added or it's a larger project, because it's if you have units that were not permitted, you're probably going to go through a pretty expensive construction process because they're going to just treat them like new construction.
Okay.
Like, so something we often hear is like, oh, well, why don't I just build them and ask for forgiveness later? And that is a total disaster and
Don't
absolutely
do that on an ADU.
Yeah, no one is going to tell you that's a good idea.
No, no. The other things that may not be good ideas, Mark, if a property's got a number of 3 bedrooms and you're going, wait a minute, I'm going to turn the 3 bedroom into 2 units. I'm going to create two 2 bedrooms out of it, or a 2 bedroom and a 1 bedroom out of it. Can that be added? Can you do that under the ADU law? Split units?
You can sometimes do that under the zoning, but they're not ADUs. So you generally cannot split units under the ADU law, but you might be able to do it under the site zoning if it's underbuilt.
Okay.
We've done that before for owners.
Yeah. Okay.
Just wanted to see what else we've got on here. Yeah, we've talked through these regulations and definitely talked through some of the challenges. I think the neighborhood opposition thing isn't that big of a deal because you're not really doing notification with these projects. And it's usually a large apartment property where people are used to having an apartment building down the street already. And so it's a lot less controversial than if you're converting a single family home to an 8-plex. We've actually seen very little pushback in these projects. Financing, and Robert just hit on some good points there. And the market demand is, we're wrapping up like a 6-unit addition right now where, the rental rate that he went in at the beginning of the project on, I think his expectations now for the ADUs are 25% above what his expectation for the rental rate was when we started construction like 13 months ago, because the owner is so surprised at how good the new units look. He's like, yeah, these are basically new construction apartments now. They're not like the units upstairs anymore. These are like the best units in the neighborhood. And that's typically what we see. The ADUs often rent for more than the existing building units that are comparable size in the same complex.
Good. Let me just bring a separate topic involved here, Mark, and that is, ADUs are also discussed for single-family residential. Homeowners building what they call, in-laws quarters or ADUs in their backyard. They're a completely different animal with different considerations, right? I think California, you guys have got to check with your lawyer. Don't rely on me for this one. But I believe that California made a change that you can split the lot on an ADU and you can sell off your ADU separately from the home you've got.
That's only certain cities. So
there you go.
That's an opt-in program. And so there's a number of places that have already opted into that, but not everywhere. So you'd have to check in your jurisdiction.
Right. So again, the ADUs that we're talking about during the seminar really is multifamily for apartment buildings. And that's the point I want to make.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. And there are, I should add in that aside from the ADU law, there are other ways under the state law that you can add units to these apartment complexes. Like we've looked at properties using the state density bonus instead of the ADU law, where you could theoretically add a lot more units. So we reviewed a property in Fremont where the owner, I think between the ADUs and a density bonus building, could add about 90 units. And so, it's a separate parcel of 2 tennis courts. And with the state density bonus, they could do like 35 units on the tennis courts as like new construction apartments. And so, the state law has become very favorable for these kind of projects. There's a lot of angles that you can look at these through, and there's a lot of different options as far as, ADUs are definitely the most straightforward, but there's also ways beyond that to add even more density sometimes.
Is the state density bonus issue, Mark, is that, how common is it in the Bay Area? And is it located in certain parts of the Bay Area more than others?
No, it's a state law.
Okay.
It's a state law. And there's some cities that have a local density bonus that might be an option you could choose instead of the state one, and would have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But in general, you agree to add a percentage of below market rate units in exchange for getting a big bump in the allowable density. And you also get a lot of relaxations on the zoning requirements. So like in a lot of cities, you'd have to do the affordable units anyway. It's just part of the planning code. So if you elect to go the density bonus route, you might get 50% more units in exchange for just, putting in the 15% affordability requirement. The ADUs have no affordability requirement, and they don't carry the other restrictions that going through the normal planning process does. But you are capped sometimes on the number of ADUs, whereas the density bonus might unlock more potential, depending on your site.
Right. Can you have a mixture?
Yeah, I mean, that property I mentioned that we looked at in Fremont, I think they had an option to do, like 45 ADUs, and then they could do 35, something around 35 units through the density bonus. And they could have just permitted those as two separate projects. I mean, I think that's on hold right now, but it's definitely something the owner's thinking about.
Good. And it's something that people should be aware of, to take a look at either in an acquisition of a property, disposition of a property, or just what they currently hold right now. Good. Okay, Mark, thank you.
Yeah, we've talked through a lot of the design considerations. A lot of it is just about maximizing the space efficiency. Sometimes a studio apartment is more marketable than a really small one bedroom, and kind of just looking at those layout options and seeing, how you're balancing how many parking spaces you want to lose with what size of apartments you want to provide, and what your unit mix is. Something we've heard a lot in the suburbs with older properties is like, hey, we don't have any studios. We have like an endless demand for studios, and we have all 2 bedrooms, and we would really like to add studios because of this demand. We also hear, hey, we've got all studios and we don't have any 2 bedrooms, and we really need 2 bedrooms because there's all these families that want to move in here because of the school down the street. And so that's the discussion to have in that feasibility phase, is like, what's the unit mix we want to look at? Is there a trade-off where maybe we want to do bigger units and less of them, or we want to max out the maximum number of units with small units? And thinking about the impact on parking for each of those options.
Right, and there's going to be inherent just design constraints. Tuck under parking, you're only going to have light coming in from one end of that unit. So you're going to be dealing with the dark unit at some point, and where that darkness lies in bedrooms or whatever, just understand that there will be constraints on the design that can be done. But because it's a new design, you're typically going to have a better floor plan layout than what was designed in the 60s in the Bay Area, where units are coming under functional obsolescence at this point. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, and I think we talked through this property value increase. That's clearly that's the reason you're doing this.
Hopefully, yes.
Not for the fun of it.
Yeah, not a good hobby. All right.
Yeah, no, definitely not a good hobby. Tax implications, this is definitely one to look at. I will say, though, that your entire property is not going to get reassessed. I mean, you're going to want to talk to the assessor in the city that you're located in to sort of understand exactly how they're going to calculate this. But they're going to base it off of the construction value of the project, not off of the entire property. And the way the assessor values it is generally a lot cheaper than the market value of the building, which is a benefit of doing ADUs versus buying units on the market, because the dollar per square foot the assessor puts on the new construction is sometimes, half, 2/3 of the actual market value of the new units. So yeah, there is going to be a reassessment, but there's going to be a big bump in value.
Yeah, you will have a cost increase on your property insurance. You will have an increase in your property taxes, but still, cash flow and just market valuation, the equity you're putting in far exceeds that. It's not a reason not to do it.
Yeah, and this is what we've been talking about. And the long-term benefits are the rental income and property value, and obviously those two things are directly correlated.
Yeah.
Yeah, the return on investment, obviously that varies property to property depending on what project you're doing. The return on an ADU project, though, is, there's like a lot of people getting into value add investing right now. A lot of times that's like putting in vinyl plank floors and repainting the unit entry doors. Yeah, you're going to reposition the units, get a little bit of a bump in value, but the ADU, I mean, it's a lot more work, but it's a much bigger return as far as the overall cash flow of the property, given the fact that you're creating all this value out of thin air practically. You know, you're converting the back vacant area on your lot into 3 detached units, you know, and all of a sudden you're running them all for, you know, $2,600 a month each or something.
It's a multiplier to value,
Yeah.
not incremental to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, neighborhood considerations, you know, as we mentioned, there isn't a notification process for these. It's not like what you may think of developing an apartment building in San Jose 10 years ago. It's optional. Definitely, like if it's going to be disruptive, you definitely want to talk to the people next door. If you're going to need construction access through a neighboring property, you got to start those discussions early. Good to get the tenants on board and let them know what's going on, so you're not facing a litany of complaints once construction starts. You know, and getting a good contractor on board who's used to working in apartment buildings is also key. You do not want to hire the guy that remodeled your kitchen at your house to do a multifamily ADU project. Like, you just do not want to do it. You need to hire somebody who's used to working in an occupied building.
That was one of the first questions I asked Mark years ago when we started working together. Hey, Mark, I've got a good home remodeler, and his comment, I won't repeat it here, but it's Robert, no. So thanks for reminding me of that, Mark.
Yeah, you don't want someone who doesn't know what a fire alarm system is putting in 10 units into an apartment building.
Good, great advice. Okay.
Yeah. And this is, and that is actually is a good segue into preparing for ADU construction, because, you know, you want to do your research, you want to consult professionals, you want to like plan effectively, you want to like find the construction team early and sort of have realistic expectations for construction. You know, sometimes we've done these units with people who haven't done a construction project since 1980, and they think construction is going to be $75 a square foot, and it's just not. You know, it's going to be a couple $100 a square foot. It might be $400, $500 a square foot, depending on the project. However, you know, you have to look at what the property is going to be worth at the end of the day, and so you have to have realistic expectations. You're going to have to work with a professional contractor. There's going to be fees you're going to have to pay, but you know, you all need to evaluate it within the big picture of what the final return is going to be on the project.
Perfect. Good.
And these are all the photos on here are projects that we've actually done for multifamily property owners in the Bay Area. The one that you see on there now is that 42 unit addition that's in San Mateo County. That was all tuck under parking, and now it's a common area between new 1-bedroom apartments. And so, you know, just we're able to repeat that all over the site till we hit the 25% limit.
You'd never know it, Mark, from what was done. And that goes back to, you know, with some of these projects, it's not just the construction. Looking at the photo, you've got hardscaping, what landscaping you add, the changes you need to make as well. Just something to keep in mind. Yep. Good.
Yeah.
This is important, Mark, because I would just make a point that the law has already changed since January 2020, right? Now it allows us more units, essentially, or a minimum number. If you've got 8 units, you can build up to 8 units, right? And I'll just state that IPS watches this law closely just because of the huge advantage it gives our clients to add equity valuation to their property. And I will say that if there are major changes to accessory dwelling units, we'll just plan on schedule. Hopefully Mark will be available for us at that time, and we'll update you on what's new and what's happening, what the new opportunities are, or things you need to look out for.
Yeah, and it's changed almost every year. To your point, since 2020, there's been at least one incremental update each year since then, and there may be more during this legislative session, and there's nothing's finalized yet, but it's definitely evolving and it's become more flexible over time.
Perfect.
And this is I feel like this is kind of an obvious one where, increasing density in these developed areas in a way that's really cost effective, is something that, and also in a way that is generally non-controversial in the neighborhood, because you're putting more units in the neighborhood, but you're putting them on a site that's already got a multifamily property. And so you're getting more people into the places where people really want to live. A lot of these neighborhoods, especially in the denser parts of Silicon Valley, San Jose, San Francisco, there's not a lot of space for new apartment buildings, but, there are a lot of these underbuilt lots from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where we can cost effectively put in new units. And this property on the screen now is the rendering because it's still under construction. 17 units going into a property in Campbell. This is the one where we had some detached garage buildings. Campbell had a pretty favorable planning department interpretation that let us add a second floor to some of the units. And so this property is going to be a real major value add for those owners when it's completed.
And that's a property that IPS is managing that we're working with Mark adding. And I'll have you note that Mark was able to put a second floor or a loft area on some of the units as well. So it turned them into a townhome.
Yeah, and this is an interesting project because it was a combo of tuck under units, a conversion of an existing outbuilding, and some conversion of these parking garages. And the garages weren't even rented. There were a couple of them rented, but it was definitely an opportunity to make some more money with this existing kind of family-owned property.
They weren't rented because in January 2020, when I found out about the law, the next month I was in front of an attorney on what to do, and we started at that point after that meeting to empty the garages. And of course, March 2020 hit. We all know what happened then. The world blew up with COVID. And we're now, more than halfway through the project.
Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah, this was one of those ones where it was on hold for a while, and then now we're almost at the finish line.
Yeah,
and I would say that is a good reminder that in a lot of cities, if you bundle parking with people's leases, it's tricky to remove the parking in some cases later.
Correct. So right.
You really want to have a clear parking policy at your properties where, if you decide to do one of these properties, it's feasible because, you haven't let one tenant own 5 cars.
From a management standpoint, you're right. You don't want to add it to the lease and put them on a 12-month lease and a 12-month hold on their garage. You want to do a separate parking agreement and do it pretty much month to month. Yeah, to give yourself the flexibility. Clay, we have about another 14, 13 minutes left.
Sure.
Any questions?
Yeah, I got one question that came through a little bit earlier. Can you walk us through a real world example of where adding ADU significantly increased property's equity?
Mark, have you got any examples besides this one here in Campbell?
Yeah, I mean, we have what people were doing a lot of prior to the interest rate increase was they were able to, we had a property in San Francisco where I think it was a 12-unit property where they added 5 additional units. So they had 3 tuck under parking spaces and then 2 detached units in the backyard. And, so they increased the monthly rent, I would say, by about 50%. The new units, some of the new units rented for more than some of the existing units, even though it wasn't quite like a 50% increase in unit count. And so in those properties, what people were able to do was refinance the whole property after construction, based on the new value of the rental of the units. And the new units in that case in San Francisco, I think were all they were like 1 bedrooms and kind of big studios, and they were all renting for like $2,800 to $3,500 a month. And so your new property valuation, at say we're at a 4% cap rate at that point. It's higher, probably higher now, but you're looking at the value of those units, and all of a sudden, say those units end up being worth $400,000 a door, and you've got 5 of them. That's 400,000 times 5 units right there on the valuation of that property. And that was, now the refinance might not be as attractive, given where interest rates are, especially if you already refinanced back in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So the strategy might be different. The strategy might be more of a cash flow strategy now, where you're just enjoying a lot more monthly income, especially if the property was paid off. So I think that's all stuff, you would want to figure out with Robert's team at the beginning of the project. But yeah, that multiplier on the income is still huge on the property value. I mean,
it is. And to just get a walkthrough through a real world, like on the the Campbell property that's on the screen now, you've got to envision where you see the white concrete, that was a driveway, and where you see the yellow orange doors here, those were all individual closed garages for enclosed garages that were either being used by tenants for storage that we had them remove, or even during prior management, outside people had come in and were renting the garages. So they were relatively easy to vacate during that time. I think, and Clay, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're looking at a cost maybe on a project of about 175,000 units to construct.
Mm-hmm.
And you figure the value for these properties, these are 1 bedroom, a couple of studios in there. We're probably looking at 450,000 unit on a construction cost of 150, 175. That's instant equity.
I think that was based on the original contract. Obviously, with change orders and things that came in, that changed a little bit, but there's still
Right.
immediate upside in equity that needs to be considered there.
Right.
And I would say that, like, we should be clear with everyone that the cost of the project is not just the construction cost. There's, the architecture and engineering fees.
Correct,
Mhm.
Mark.
There's also like permitting fees, which can be substantial from the city.
Sure.
So,
PG&E,
yeah,
water department,
PG&E, water department,
landscaping, hardscape, trenching, asphalt work, all of that.
Yeah. And so there's a lot, but you're still, maybe you're at $250 a door and the units are worth $375, and that's a tremendous return.
Right.
Right. And that's, that's the return that you get once you've got the notice of occupancy, right? You've got the value then at that point. You're not waiting for cap rates to drop as interest rates come back down, if and when, right?
Yeah.
Mark, the other question?
Yeah, next question is, what are the
ahead.
key zoning or permitting issues we should be aware of before starting a new ADU project?
Well, the zoning doesn't really matter as long as it's multifamily.
Okay.
Because it's a state land use law. It sort of trumps the local zoning in most ways. There's a few sort of fringe cases where the local zoning might come into play, but for the most part, as long as it's multifamily zoning, you can do this. And if it's single family, you can add ADUs as well, just less of them. So that's kind of the major thing. I do think that on the permitting side, like, there's some cities that are just harder to deal with than others. If anyone in the webinar has done construction before, you probably have dealt with the building department and know how that can be. So, just having a realistic expectation that there's probably going to be some delays during permitting, I think is reasonable.
The final question we have in here is, how do ADUs compare to other value add strategies like garage conversions or duplex splits in terms of ROI? I'm assuming that we're referring to, individual new construction, like if you're adding new construction where tennis court may have been, as opposed to a unit conversion where the ROI exists.
The freestanding ADUs are definitely always going to be more expensive than the garage conversions. So, you're going to be running utilities out to an area where they don't exist. You're going to be having to put in a foundation and a roof. Whereas if you're converting a already existing space in a building, you're just going to have like less structure, less everything. I think that the detached units though often rent for more money. So there's two sides of the equation there. So the ROI probably is higher on the garage conversions just because the cost is so much lower, and often you can do a lot of them. But the detached units, from a marketing standpoint, have their own attraction. As far as getting light on all four sides and sort of feeling like you're renting a single family home versus an apartment unit.
Good.
Beautiful.
People often look at prefab for the detached units. It's sometimes possible if you're only doing one or two units, but I think that the challenge with prefab comes in that it's not very adaptable to the site. So especially if you're looking at some of these densely built out sites in San Jose or something, where you just don't have room for these prefab units. Usually they don't fit. If they do fit, they end up being very awkward, or you get a lot less units because you can't tailor them to the site. I think in the single family context, or maybe in the duplex context where you're maybe it makes sense to do a prefab, but they aren't that much cheaper than site built, and they come with a lot of built-in constraints. I think that would be the way to think about that, because that's one of the first questions people usually ask us.
Good. Anything else, Clay?
No, I want to thank you both for your time. Obviously, Mark, you've been very helpful, and your expertise has been paramount in guiding us through this process for our clients.
Yeah, and Mark's not only very knowledgeable, lots of experience, he's also great to work with too. So
yeah.
Mark's our go-to guy here at IPS. Can't recommend him enough. Good.
Great.
Mark, thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Robert.
And thank everyone for joining us.
Of course.
We will have a copy of this. We will put it on an IPS YouTube page. We will send a copy of it to all the participants, everyone that is registered. You'll also get a copy of the slide deck as well. And again, I just want to thank everybody for your time and being here today. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Clay.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.